The morning the king stopped speaking, no order was given, no letter sent, no proclamation nailed to any door. He simply did not say the words he had always said, and the whole of Harrogate learned in a single day that the world had turned under their feet. I was the one who noticed it first, because noticing was my post. My name is Bran Kettle, and for 11 years I stood the inner corridors of the royal house of Harrogate as a guard of the king's own body, a man in a red tunic and tall black bearskin whose task was not to speak but to see. A guard who talks is a guard who has forgotten his trade. So I watched. I watched the way a farmer watches weather, reading the shape of a thing long before the rain, and on that morning in the last cold week before the thaw, I read a silence coming off King Alaric like frost off stone. He came down the east stair at the 7th bell, as he did each day. He passed the tall windows where the winter light lay in long gray bars across the marble. He passed the portrait of the late Queen Consort, his first wife, dead now these 4 years, her painted eyes forever turned toward a door she would never come through again. And at the foot of the stair, where the household waited, he did the thing he had done every morning of the years I had served him, except that he did not do it. For as long as I had guarded that corridor, the king had greeted the family of his second wife, the Queen Consort Morwenna, with a courtesy so fixed it had become a law of the house. "Good morning, Lord Cassius. Lady Verena, you look well." 2 sentences. A nod. Nothing warm. The king was not a warm man toward his wife's people, but a courtesy, an acknowledgment, the small daily coin by which a king tells his court who stands inside his favor and who stands out in the cold. That morning he said nothing. He walked past Lord Cassius, Morwenna's brother, a broad man in a coat too fine for the hour, who had his mouth already open on his own answering greeting. He walked past Lady Verena, Morwenna's sister, whose hand had lifted a half-inch in the beginning of a curtsy. He did not slow. He did not turn his head. His eyes went forward and stayed forward, the way my own eyes were trained to go, and he passed them as a man passes furniture, and he went into the small council room, and the door closed behind him with a sound no louder than any other morning. But I saw Lord Cassius's mouth close on the greeting he had not been permitted to complete. I saw Lady Verena's lifted hand come down slowly, uncertainly, and settle against her skirt, as though she had forgotten what a hand was for. I saw the two of them look at each other across the width of the corridor, and I saw, I will remember it as long as I live, the exact moment a very clever, very comfortable pair of people understood that something enormous had happened, and did not yet know what. That was the whole of it. A king who did not say good morning. You will think it a small thing. It was not a small thing. In a house like ours, the king's word is weather and law and coin all at once, and the withdrawal of his word is the withdrawal of all three. A courtier who is not greeted is a courtier who is being told something, and the cruelty and the genius of it was that he was being told nothing at all, and so could answer nothing, protest nothing, defend against nothing. You cannot argue with a silence. You cannot kneel to it and beg its pardon. You cannot even be certain you have heard it. You can only stand in it and feel it close over you like water and wait to learn how deep it goes. I knew how deep it went. I knew because I was the reason for it, though not a soul in that corridor knew my part, and I meant to keep it that way. Whatever I had set in motion, I had set in motion quietly, as a guard should, and the king had taken it up in his own quiet way, and now the thing was moving, and my duty was to stand my post and let it move. Let me tell you how a silence begins. It begins, as most true things in a palace begin, with a child. The king's household held 3 children of his blood. Crown Prince Rowan, near grown now, careful and grave, a young man who had learned early that a prince is watched the way a candle is watched in a room full of dry paper. Princess Alara, his sister, 17 and quick and kind, with her dead mother's dark eyes. And little Princess Adela, no, I misname her. Adela was the king's own sister, a woman of 40 who came and went from the palace like a cold wind that scoured out corners. The youngest of the king's blood was the Princess Malin, 9 years old, who wore her hair in a plait her nurse could never keep straight, and who had, the winter I am telling you of, been ill. Not gravely ill. A fever, a weakness, the kind of sickness a child of 9 throws off in a fortnight if she is warm and fed and let alone. But Malin had not thrown it off. She had lingered, gray and thin, through the whole of the dark months, and the physicians had frowned and prescribed and frowned again, and no one could say why a healthy child should sicken so and mend so slowly. The Queen Consort Morwenna had taken charge of the child's care. This was thought at the time to be a kindness. Morwenna was not the mother of these children. Their mother was Isolde in the ground 4 years, but a stepmother who nurses a sick stepchild is a stepmother the court will praise, and Morwenna was a woman who understood the value of praise the way a merchant understands the value of coin. She moved into the sickroom's outer chamber. She controlled who came and who went. She received the physicians and relayed their words to the king, for the king in those months was buried under the affairs of a hard winter, a failed harvest in the north, a dispute over the river tolls, the 1,000 cares that fall on a crown, and he was grateful, I think, that his wife had taken this one weight from him. I stood the sickroom corridor 2 nights in 7. That is where it began for me. A guard on a night post learns the sounds of a place the way a blind man learns a room. I knew the tick of the long clock on the landing, and the way the wind found the loose pane in the west casement. I knew the tread of the night nurse, an old woman named Hesper who had nursed the king himself when he was small, and I knew the lighter, quicker step of the Queen Consort when she came, always after the household had gone to bed, always with a small covered cup on a tray she carried herself. She carried it herself. That was the first thread. A Queen Consort does not carry trays. There are servants for trays, a dozen of them, hands enough to carry anything a royal person might wish carried. But Morwenna carried the child's evening draught herself, every night up the back stair, past my post into the sickroom, and I thought at first it was tenderness, and I honored her for it, and I said nothing because saying nothing is my trade. Then, on a night near the middle of the winter, I heard the child cry. Not the fretful crying of a sick child, which I had heard often enough and which pulls at a man but tells him nothing. This was different. This was a child saying no. A thin, exhausted, frightened no, repeated, and then the low, steady voice of the Queen Consort under it, and then no more crying, only silence, and then Morwenna coming out with the empty cup on the tray, her face as smooth as a frozen pond. She saw me at my post. She always saw me, I was hard to miss, a red pillar in a dim corridor, but this night she looked at me a beat longer than a queen looks at furniture, and she said, "The child fights her medicine. Children do." And she went down the back stair, and I stood in the dark and felt the thread pull tight in my hand. A guard is not a physician. A guard is not a magistrate. A guard has no right to open a cup and smell what is in it, no right to question a queen, no right to do anything at all but stand and see and hold his tongue. I knew all of this. I had built my life on all of this. And I stood there in the cold corridor with a child's frightened no still in my ears, and I understood that I had come to the edge of the only law that was higher than the law of my silence, which is this, that a man who sees a wrong done to a helpless creature and does nothing has broken a deeper oath than any he swore to a king. But I did not act rashly. That is the part I am most careful to tell, because the young men who came after me heard the story wrong and thought I had burst into the sickroom like a hero in a ballad and snatched the cup from the queen's hand. I did no such thing. A rash guard is a dead guard, and worse, a rash guard is a useless one, for had I burst in and been wrong or been right but unable to prove it, I would have been dismissed by morning, and the child would have been left with no one watching at all. My silence was the child's only shield. I could not spend it cheaply. So I did the hardest thing a man of action can do. I waited and I watched, and I began, very quietly, to gather what I saw. I learned the nurse's habits. Old Hesper, who had nursed the king, was not permitted in the sickroom past the 8th bell. Morwenna had arranged it so, gently, on grounds of the old woman's failing eyes, and the need for the child to sleep. But Hesper slept ill herself, as the old do, and often sat in the small pantry off the corridor with a candle and her mending, and a guard who stands a post for hours may, without leaving it, exchange a word or two with an old woman who is lonely. I did not tell her what I feared. I only listened, and over the slow weeks the old woman, half to herself, told me things she did not know she was telling, that the child had been well until the queen took charge of her food, that the physicians the queen brought were not the palace physicians but men from the town, men Hesper did not know, that the child, in her clearer hours, begged not to be given the evening cup, and cried that it made her head swim and her stomach turn, and that the queen said this was the fever talking. That once, when Hesper had crept in against the rule to see her nursling, the child had gripped her hand and whispered that she wanted her real medicine, the sweet one the old doctor used to give her, not the bitter one, and Hesper had not understood and had wept, and had been sent away. I held all of this the way a man holds water in cupped hands, knowing how easily it spills, knowing that a whisper from an old woman is not proof, that a child's fear is not proof, that a queen carrying a tray is not proof. I had a shape now, a dreadful shape, but I had no bones to hang it on, and I knew who I was up against. The Queen Consort Morwenna did not come to her place by accident. She had married a grieving king in the 2nd year of his mourning, when the whole realm feared he would follow Isolde into the dark, and she had steadied him, and the court had been grateful, and she had used that gratitude the way a builder uses good stone. Her brother Lord Cassius sat on 3 of the king's councils. Her sister Lady Verena had the ear of half the great ladies of the court. Between the 3 of them they held more of the daily machinery of the palace than any of the king's blood save the king himself, appointments, moneys, the small 10,000 levers by which a house is truly run. They were not loved, but they were feared, and they were comfortable, and comfort in a palace is a kind of power all its own. And here is the thing I understood, standing in my cold corridor with my cupped hands full of water. Morwenna could not be attacked in the open. Not by me, not by anyone below the king. To accuse her was to accuse the whole apparatus she had built, to set oneself against her brother's councils and her sister's ladies, and the 4 years of gratitude the king himself still felt. A guard who accused the Queen Consort of harming the king's daughter, with nothing but an old nurse's whispers and a child's frightened no, would not be believed. He would be pitied, then dismissed, then forgotten, and the tray would go up the back stair again the next night as though he had never stood there at all. There was only one man in the realm above her, and that man had buried himself in the affairs of a hard winter, and had handed the care of his sick daughter to his wife, and did not know, could not know, because the very person who should have carried the truth to him was the person keeping it from him. So the question that shaped everything I did next was not, how do I stop her? I could not stop her. I had no power to stop her. The question was, how do I put the truth in front of the one man who can, without her seeing it come, and without spending the child's only shield to do it? That was the puzzle I carried through the last dark weeks of that winter. And the answer, when I found it, was not a blade or a shout or a broken door. The answer was a silence, given back to me by a king who had learned to read the world exactly as I read it, and who, once he saw the shape of the thing, moved against it in a way so quiet, so total, and so merciless that his wife's own family understood their ruin a full week before a single word was ever spoken aloud. Let me tell you how the truth reached him. I could not go to the king. Understand that first, for everything turns on it. A guard does not seek an audience with his sovereign. I might stand 3 feet from Alaric for 6 hours of a night, and never have the right to say a word to him beyond, "Sire," if he addressed me. To go to him, to break my post, to beg a private hearing, to lay before the crowned head of the realm an accusation against his own wife, was a thing so far outside the shape of my life that a courtier would sooner expect the marble floor to speak. And even had I found the way to reach him, I would have reached him through the very channels Morwenna controlled. His days were kept by a chamberlain who owed his place to Lord Cassius. His correspondence passed through a secretary Lady Verena had recommended. A message from a guard, marked urgent, would have crossed 3 desks that belonged to the family I meant to unmask before it ever touched the king's hand, and long before it reached him, I would have been reassigned to the coldest gatehouse in the realm, and the sickroom corridor given to a man who asked no questions. So the truth could not travel by any ordinary road. It had to be seen, not told, and it had to be seen by the king himself with his own eyes in a moment Morwenna had not arranged. I began to think like the enemy of a clever woman must think, patiently, sideways, and never in a straight line. The first bone I found for my dreadful shape was the physician's. Old Hesper had said the men who came to the sickroom were not the palace physicians but strangers from the town. I could not question them. I could barely see them, hooded and cloaked as they came up the back stair after dark. But a palace keeps records the way a body keeps scars, and there was one record I could reach without leaving my duty: the gate book. Every soul who passes the palace gates after the 9th bell is written into the gate book by the porter, name, hour, and the household by whose leave they enter. It is a small, dull ledger, and no one thinks of it, which is exactly why it is the truest book in the palace. And I had a friend at the night gate, a steady older man named Doran who had stood the gates for 30 years and owed me a good turn from a bad night some years past. I asked him, over many nights, and with great care to seem to be asking nothing, who came and went by the Queen Consort's leave after dark. Doran, who was no fool and had guessed there was more in my asking than I let on, said only, "Same 2 men, 3 nights in the week. Come by the Lady Verena's leave, not the Queen's. Signed for by a servant of Lord Cassius. Paid, I'd guess, out of the household purse Cassius keeps." And he showed me the entries, page after page, the same false plain hand signing in 2 physicians on the household's business, week upon week, back to the very week the child had first taken ill. The physicians came in by Verena's leave and were paid by Cassius's hand. That was the second bone. The sickness that would not mend had a whole family's fingerprints on it, and the family had been careful, as clever families are, to keep the Queen's own name off the ledger, so that if ever a question was asked, it was the sister who invited and the brother who paid, and the Queen herself had done nothing but nurse a sick child with a tray in her own 2 hands. I understood then that I was not facing a single wicked woman. I was facing a design. 3 people who trusted one another, dividing the work of a slow cruelty so that no one of them held enough of it to be caught. And I understood something colder still, that a design so careful was built to survive discovery. They had planned for the day someone might look. The only thing they had not planned for was that the someone would be a guard, a piece of furniture, a red pillar, a man beneath their notice, who had all winter to stand in a dark corridor and think. Now what was the design for? A stepmother who slowly sickens a stepchild, to what end? I turned it over on 100 cold nights, and the answer, when it came, was as old as inheritance itself. The king had 3 children of his first marriage, and, as yet, none of his second. Morwenna was younger than the king by a dozen years, and it was no secret in the court that she hoped for a child of her own, a child who would be, whatever the law said about the elder half-siblings, the child of the reigning Queen Consort, with all her family's machinery arrayed behind it. But the king's 3 stood first. Rowan would be king. Alara and Malin were princesses of the blood, endowed, dowered, placed. A living wall of Isolde's children stood between Morwenna's hopes and the fullness of what she wanted for her line. I do not say she meant to kill the child. I have thought about this more than any other part of it in the years since, and I have never been able to say with certainty what was in that woman's heart. Perhaps she meant only to keep Malin weak, a sickly princess, unmarriageable, a burden, quietly set aside from the succession by the simple fact of a health that never mended. Perhaps she meant to establish herself so wholly as the child's sole and indispensable nurse that when the king's grief for Isolde had fully cooled, It would be Morwenna he leaned on, Morwenna's family whose hands were on every lever, Morwenna's future child who would rise as the others faded. Perhaps she meant worse. I do not know. What I knew was that a healthy child was being made ill by a design, and that the design served the ambitions of the Queen Consort's family, and that this was enough. A guard does not need to weigh a heart to know a wrong. He needs only to see the wrong being done. But knowing was not proving, and proving was not reaching the king, and reaching the king was the whole of the mountain I had to climb. The break came from a place I did not expect. It came from Alara. Princess Alara was 17 that winter, old enough to be uneasy and young enough to be dismissed, and she loved her small sister with the fierce, helpless love of a girl who had lost her mother young, and had made of the younger children a kind of family to hold. She had been kept from the sickroom too. Morwenna had drawn the same gentle veil over her that she had drawn over old Hesper, all soft words about rest and contagion, and the child's need for quiet. But a princess of 17 is not so easily set in a corner as a nurse of 70, and Alara had grown suspicious in her own way, and one gray afternoon she found me at my post between watches and did a thing no royal person had done to me in 11 years. She asked me a true question and waited for a true answer. "You stand the night corridor," she said. She did not ask it, she stated it the way her father stated things. "You see her go in with the cup. Kettle, is my sister being cared for, or is she being kept?" A guard is trained to have no answer to such a question. I could not say, "Your Highness," is the whole of what my trade permitted, and I had said it 1,000 times to 1,000 idle askers and meant nothing by it. But this was not an idle asker. This was a frightened girl who loved a frightened child, and she had come to the one man in the palace who stood outside the family's design and saw the tray go up the stair every night, and she was asking me to be, for one moment, not a piece of furniture but a man. I have broken my silence exactly twice in my life. This was the first. I did not tell her what I feared. I had no right to load a girl of 17 with a horror I could not yet prove. But I did not lie to her either. I looked at the Princess Alara and I said, "Your Highness, I would want a physician I trusted to see the Princess Malin, one of the palace physicians, in daylight, and I would want it done in a way the Queen Consort did not arrange." She went very still. She was quick, that girl. She heard everything I did not say folded inside the little I did. And she understood at once the same wall I had spent the winter breaking my head against, that she could not simply summon a physician, because the summoning would pass through the family's hands, and the family would smooth it away as they had smoothed away everything else. "She controls the physicians," Alara said slowly. "She controls who sees Malin. She controls what my father is told." Her dark eyes, Isolde's eyes, came up to mine. "She controls everything but you." "I control nothing, Your Highness." "You control what you have seen," she said, "and you control whether my father sees it too." And there, in a gray corridor between two watches, a 17-year-old girl said aloud the exact thing I had been circling all winter, and gave me the first half of the road to the king. For if I could not reach Alaric, and Alara could not force a physician past the family's hands, then perhaps the two halves joined could do what neither could do alone. She had the blood to stand beside her father. I had the eyes that had seen. Between us we had, for the first time, the beginnings of a way to put the truth where Morwenna could not intercept it, in front of the king in daylight, with a witness of his own blood at his side. But we had to be careful, and we had to be right, and above all we had to be silent, because the instant the family sensed a question forming, they would move the child, or send away the nurse, or find some soft reason to shift my post, and the whole slow winter of watching would blow away like ash. So Alara and I made a compact in that corridor in whispers, and the compact was this: gather everything, move nothing, and wait for the 1 hour when the king could be reached without the family in the room. That hour, as it happened, was already coming toward us. It came in the shape of the winter's end, and a custom of the house, and a small locked door. The custom was this. On the last day of winter, by a tradition older than any living memory, the king of Harrogate went alone to the old chapel beneath the east wing to keep a vigil for the house's dead. Alone, that was the whole point of it. No chamberlain, no secretary, no wife, no counsel. For 1 hour on the turn of the year, the king of Harrogate belonged to no one but the graves of those who had gone before him. And by the law of the custom, not even the Queen Consort might follow him down. Alaric kept the vigil for Isolde. Everyone knew it, though no one said it. He would go down to the old chapel where the house's dead were remembered, and he would stand an hour in the cold, and he would come up changed for a day or two, quieter, older, further away, and the court had learned to let those days pass without troubling him. Morwenna, I think, hated the vigil, for it was the 1 hour of the year in which the dead first wife stood higher in the king's heart than the living second one, and there was nothing the family's machinery could do to touch it. It was the king's, and only the king's. It was also the 1 hour of the year in which Alaric could be reached, with no one of Morwenna's people between him and the person who came to him. But I could not simply appear in the chapel. A guard who breaks into the king's private vigil to babble accusations is a madman, and would be treated as one. The truth had to arrive in a form the king would not dismiss and could not unsee, and it had to arrive through a door Morwenna did not hold. Here Ilara and I turned to the small locked door, and to the second person of the king's blood we brought into our compact, the Crown Prince Rowan. I had feared to bring Rowan in. He was near a man grown, careful and grave, and I did not know which way he would jump, whether he would see the danger to his sister and stand with us, or whether he would recoil from the enormity of accusing the Queen Consort and in his caution, carry the alarm straight to his father in a way the family could intercept and smother. But Ilara knew her brother as I could not, and Ilara said, "Rowan loved our mother, and he loves Malin. He will be careful, but careful is what we need. He will not shout, he will help us do this quietly," and she was right. Rowan came to me in the same gray corridor 2 nights after his sister, and he did not ask me idle questions. He had already spoken with Ilara, he already knew the shape of our fear. What he brought to the compact was the thing neither Ilara nor I possessed, a key. The physicians who came up the back stair by night, the strangers, the town men paid out of Cassius's purse, kept their instruments and their drafts in a small closed cabinet in a room off the sickroom corridor, a room that had once been a still room where the household simples and cordials were made, and which now, by the family's quiet arrangement, was kept locked and given over to the night physician's use. I had watched that door all winter. I had never once seen inside it. And behind it, I was certain, lay the last bones of my dreadful shape. The actual drafts, the actual instruments, the physical proof that the medicine going into the child was not the medicine a sick child should receive. The room was locked, but it was a room of the old still room, and the old still rooms of Harrogate had all been keyed like a century ago, before anyone thought a still room worth a separate lock. And Rowan, who as a boy had haunted every disused corner of the palace the way lonely royal children do, knew where the old master key of the household still rooms hung on its forgotten hook in the steward's back passage. It was the kind of thing only a child who had once had the run of an empty wing would know. And it was exactly the kind of key Morwenna's careful family had never thought to change, because they had never imagined that a boy's old idle knowledge would one winter become the hinge on which their whole design turned. "I can open it," Rowan said, "once. On a night when the physicians do not come, there are 4 nights in the week they do not come. But if we open it and find nothing, or find something we cannot read, we will have spent our one silent move for nothing, and she will know the lock was tried. Then we do not open it until we can bring someone who can read what is inside," I said. And the 3 of us, a guard, a princess, a prince, stood in the cold and understood at the same moment who that someone must be. Not a physician. Every physician in the realm might be bought, or frightened, or belong already to the family's web. We could trust none of them until we knew which. There was only one person in the palace whose knowledge we could trust absolutely and whose loyalty stood entirely outside Morwenna's reach. The Princess Adela, the king's own sister. I have not yet told you enough of Adela, and I must, because without her the whole design would have stood. Adela was the king's elder sister, a woman of 40-odd who had never married and had made of her spinsterhood not a sorrow but a freedom. She had spent her years in the study of the healing arts, not as a court physician, which no princess could be, but as a scholar of them, a woman who had read every herbal and every treatise the great library held and who ran, out of her own purse and her own stubbornness, a house of care for the poor and the sick at the edge of the town. She knew draughts and simples and poisons as few living men knew them. And she loathed Morwenna with the clean, unhidden loathing of a woman who owes nothing to anyone, and has never once in her life pretended to a feeling she did not hold. Adela came and went from the palace like a cold wind. I have said that already, and it was the truest thing about her. She was not part of the daily household. She could not be watched by the family's machinery, because she stood outside it, above it, older in blood than the Queen Consort would ever be. And she loved her brother's children with the fierce guardianship of an aunt who has made them, in the absence of her own, the whole of her family. If we could bring Adela to the locked room, on a night the physicians did not come, with the old still-room key, she could read the drafts. She could say with the authority of the king's own sister, and a lifetime study, whether the medicine going into the Princess Malin was medicine or was something else. And her word, unlike a guard's whisper or a nurse's fear or a child's frightened no, was a word the king would have to hear. So the compact grew from 3 to 4, and the road to the king took its final shape. Alara would bring her aunt into the secret. Rowan would take the key and open the still-room door. Adela would read what lay inside. And I, the guard, the piece of furniture, the man beneath their notice, I would do the one thing my post allowed and no one else's did. I would choose the hour. I would watch the family's every movement, and I would know, better than any of them, the single night on which the still room could be opened unseen, and the single hour in which the truth we found there could be carried down to a king keeping vigil alone in a cold chapel, with no one of Morwenna's blood anywhere near to intercept it. We set the night for the vigil itself, the last day of winter, the 1 hour of the year the family could not touch. I have not yet told you the part that frightens me still to remember, which is how nearly the family sensed us. For a design as careful as Morwenna's does not survive by luck, it survives by watchfulness. And in the last days before the vigil, the family's watchfulness turned, by an instinct I have never been able to explain, toward the very corner where we stood. It began with Lady Verena. She was the cleverest of the three, I came to believe cleverer than her brother, whose power was all bluff and coin, and in some ways cleverer than the Queen herself, whose power was all position. Verena's power was that she watched people, the way I watched people, and she had begun to watch me. I first felt it as a wrongness in the corridor, the way you feel a draft from a door you cannot see. Verena took to passing the sickroom corridor at odd hours, on errands too thin to be real, and each time she passed she looked at me. Not the way a lady looks at a guard, which is not to look at all, but the way one watcher looks at another, measuring. Once she stopped, and asked me in her soft voice whether I found the night post cold, and whether I would not prefer a warmer station, and did I know that such things could be arranged. It was a threat wrapped in a kindness, and I heard it for what it was. She was telling me that my post was hers to move, and warning me, without a single hard word, that she had noticed I stood it too well and saw too much. I answered as a piece of furniture answers, "The post suits me, my lady." A guard is warmed by his duty, and I let her see nothing in my face, nothing at all, the whole winter's frost of my discipline, and she went away not certain but not easy, and I knew that the sand was running out. Verena would not move against me on a suspicion. She was too careful for that, and a guard dismissed for nothing invites questions. But she was watching now, and a watcher who watches long enough sees. We had days, perhaps, not weeks. Then Cassius did a thing that nearly ended everything. 2 nights before the vigil, he had the gate porter changed. My friend Doran, 30 years at the night gate, Doran, who had shown me the gate book, was told without warning that he was needed at the far river gate, and a new man, a man of Cassius's household, was set at the night gate in his place. It was done as a small administrative shuffle, the kind of thing that happens in a great house every week and means nothing. But I knew what it meant. Somewhere in the machinery, a wheel had turned. Someone had wondered why the old porter and the sickroom guard had grown friendly. Someone had decided, out of nothing but a careful person's love of tidiness, to separate 2 men who saw too much of each other. They did not know what we knew. But they had begun, blindly, to close the small doors we had been slipping the truth through. And if they closed enough of them before the vigil, the whole plan would die of 100 small tidyings, none of which anyone could ever be accused of, because each one alone was nothing. That is the terror of a careful enemy. You cannot fight them, because they never do a single thing you can point to. They only, slowly, make the world close around you, one reasonable little adjustment at a time, until one morning you find every door you meant to use is quietly locked, and no one can say who locked it. We had to move before the doors finished closing, and we had exactly 1 hour in which to move, and it was coming, and everything now depended on my choosing it right. The last day of winter came in gray and still, with a sky the color of pewter and no wind at all, the kind of dead quiet day on which sound carries and a careless step betrays a man. I stood my post through the morning with my heart as level as I could keep it, which is to say I stood it the way I had stood every post of 11 years, because a guard who lets his fear show has already lost, and I could not afford to lose that day. The physicians did not come that night. I had known they would not. The last day of winter was a day of vigil for the whole house, and even the town men Cassius paid kept away from the palace on it. The still room would be empty. The corridor would be thin of servants. And at the turning of the afternoon into evening, the king would go down alone to the old chapel beneath the east wing, and for 1 hour the whole weight of Morwenna's family would be turned toward the ordinary business of an ordinary evening, with no reason on earth to look toward a locked still room or a cold chapel. At the ringing of the vespers bell, Alaric came down the east stair in his plain dark vigil coat, unattended as the custom demanded, and I watched him pass toward the old chapel with his face already gone far away into his grief, and I let 1 full minute pass after the chapel door closed behind him. Then I left my post. I want to be clear about what leaving my post meant, for it is the second time in my life I broke my silence and the only time I broke my duty, and I have never regretted it and never once told myself it was small. A guard does not leave his post. It is the first thing he learns and the last thing he forgets. To leave it is to fail in the one plain thing his whole life is built on. I left it that evening knowing exactly what I was doing, and I did it because there is a duty higher than a post, and I had known it since the night I heard a child say no, and I would answer for the rest of it however God and the king saw fit. Rowan was at the still-room door with the old master key in his hand. Alara was beside him, white to the lips but steady. And Adela, the king's sister, wrapped in a plain gray cloak, come into the palace that afternoon on one of her ordinary visits, so that no gate book anywhere recorded anything but a princess calling on her nieces. Adela stood a little apart with her scholar's satchel over her shoulder and her face set like a judge's. The key turned. The old lock, unchanged in 100 years, gave with a small dry click that in that dead quiet corridor sounded to me like a bell. The door opened, and we went in, the 4 of us, into the low old still room where the family's careful design kept its instruments. It took Adela less than the length of the vigil to read the whole of it. I will not burden you with the physician's words she spoke, for I did not fully understand them then and only half understand them now. What I understood was her face. She opened the closed cabinet. Rowan's key fit that lock too, for it was still room work throughout. And she took down the stoppered bottles one by one, and held them to the last gray window light and uncapped them and smelled them and once touched a drop to her tongue and spat it clean into her handkerchief. And with each one her face grew harder and further away, and at the last she stood very still with a small dark bottle in her hand and said, in a voice I had never heard from her and hope never to hear from anyone again, "This is not medicine. This has never once been medicine. Whoever gave this to a sick child, night on night all winter, meant that child never to mend." She did not weep. Adela was not a woman who wept, but she gripped that bottle until her knuckles went white, and she looked at the three of us, and she said the thing that turned our winter of watching into the shape of the king's silence. "My brother must see this. Tonight. Now. Before anyone knows the room was opened. And he must see it from us, not hear of it, see it, because if this reaches him through any mouth but ours, it will reach him already softened, already explained away, already turned into a sick child's fever and a devoted stepmother's tears. He must hold this bottle in his own hand while I tell him what is in it. There is no other way it can be believed." And so we did the thing I had been building the whole winter toward, though I had never quite let myself picture it. We carried the truth, in a small dark bottle, down to the old chapel beneath the east wing, and we put it into the hand of a king keeping vigil for his dead wife. I stood at the chapel door while they went in, Adela first, then Rowan, then Alaric. It was not my place to enter, and I did not wish to. What passed between a king and his blood in that cold stone room was not for a guard's eyes. I stood the door as I had stood 1,000 doors, and I heard, through the old oak, the low murmur of Adela's voice going on, level and terrible, and I heard it stop, and then I heard nothing at all for a very long time. That silence from behind the chapel door was the first breath of the silence that would fall over the whole palace. I did not know it yet. I only knew that a king was standing in the dark with a bottle in his hand, and the truth of his wife's family closing over him like cold water, and that whatever came next would come out of that quiet. When the door opened, Alaric came out first, and I have never before or since seen a man so changed in the space of an hour. He had gone into that chapel a grieving husband and a distracted king. He came out something else, something I have no better word for than winter itself. His face was perfectly composed. That was the terrible thing. There was no rage in it, no grief, no tremor. The storm had all gone inward, down to some deep place where kings keep the things too large for a face to hold. And what showed on the surface was only a stillness so complete it made my own trained stillness look like a child's fidgeting. He looked at me. The king of Harrogate looked at the guard who had left his post, who had broken his silence and his duty, who had brought this ruin into his house on the last evening of winter. And I braced, as a man braces, for whatever a king does to a guard who has done such things. He said one thing to me, only one, in a voice as level as still water. "How long have you known?" "Since the middle of the winter, sire," I said. "I could not be sure, and I could not reach you." He was quiet a moment. "Then, no, you could not." And in those 3 words I understood that he had grasped the whole of it, the machinery, the closed channels, the family's hands on every door, grasped it faster and more completely than I had grasped it over a whole winter of nights, because he had lived 30 years inside that machinery and knew to the inch how it worked and who worked it. He understood, in the space of a breath, exactly how his own house had been turned into a wall around a sickened child, with himself sealed on the wrong side of it. And I saw the understanding go through him like a blade, and I saw him take it and hold it and put it away behind that terrible still face. "You will say nothing of this," the king said. "Not to me only, to all 4 of us," his voice gathering us in. "Not a word. Not to a servant, not to a friend, not to each other in any room that has ears. The Princess Malin will be moved tonight, quietly, into my sister's care, into rooms my sister chooses, with physicians my sister names and no one else's, and it will be given out that she is sent to the country air for her health. That is all anyone will hear. The child will be safe by morning, and no one who wishes her ill will know that anything at all has changed until it is far too late for them to act. And the Queen Consort, sire, it was Rowan who asked it low. The king was silent for a long moment. And when he answered, he gave us the whole shape of what he meant to do, and it was not what any of us had imagined, and it was more frightening than any of us had imagined, because it was the coldest and the surest and the most complete thing a king could do. I will do nothing, Alaric said, that they can see coming. I will make no accusation. I will hold no counsel, sign no order, speak no word against her or her people that any tongue could carry to them as a warning. If I move against them in the open, they will do what careful people do. They will burn what can be burned, coach the physicians, arrange their alibis, weep and explain and wrap themselves in 4 years of my gratitude, and half my court will believe them, because half my court owes its comfort to them. An open charge is a charge they can survive. He turned the small dark bottle over once in his hand, and the last of the chapel's candlelight moved on the glass. So I will not charge them. I will simply stop. From tomorrow I will not give them what I have given them every day for 4 years. I will not greet them. I will not consult them. I will not sign the papers that pass through their hands. I will not receive them. I will take back, one silence at a time, every scrap of favor and function that made them powerful, and I will do it so quietly that there will be nothing anywhere for them to point to and protest. They will wake tomorrow into a world that has turned against them, and they will not be able to find the edge of it, and they will not be able to fight it, because you cannot fight a thing that has not been said. I will do to them exactly what they did to my daughter. I will close the house around them, one small quiet door at a time, until there is nowhere left for them to stand. And by the time they understand what has happened to them, the child will be safe, the proof will be gathered, and it will be finished. He looked at the 4 of us in the cold chapel doorway. They made a wall of my silence and my grief, the king said. They will learn what my silence is when it is turned the other way. And that is how a silence begins. So we come back to the morning I began with. The morning the king did not say good morning. And now you know what stood behind it, and you can understand what I understood, watching from my post as Lord Cassius's mouth closed on a greeting that never came and Lady Verena's hand came down slowly against her skirt. The child had gone in the night. Adela had taken her, wrapped and warm and half asleep, down a back stair and out a gate whose book recorded only the Princess Adela departing with an attendant. And by dawn Malin was in a house at the edge of the town where no physician of Cassius's paying would ever find her, in the care of an aunt who would sooner have died than let another false draught near her. The court was told the princess had been sent to the country for her health, and the court believed it, because there was nothing else to believe. Not one word of the true reason was anywhere in the world for the family to catch hold of. And then the king simply stopped. I watched it happen over the days that followed the way I had watched everything that winter from my post, silent, seeing. And I tell you there has never been a crueler thing done in that palace, nor a cleaner one, and it was done entirely without a single word that anyone could ever repeat. The first day it was only the morning greeting. Cassius and Verena told themselves it was nothing. The king was low after his vigil, as he always was. The vigil days were strange days. It would pass. I saw them tell themselves this. I saw Cassius square his shoulders and Verena smooth her face, and I saw them decide, because comfortable people always decided, that everything was fine. The second day, the king did not send for Lord Cassius before the morning council. For 4 years Cassius had gone in to the king each council morning a half hour before the rest, to lay the matters out, to shape what would be discussed, to be, in the small unwatched hour before the great men came, the king's right hand. That half hour was the truest measure of his power, and it was gone. No message came. Cassius waited in the anteroom until the other counselors arrived and then went in with them, one of many, And I watched him understand as he crossed that threshold that his half-hour had not been forgotten but withdrawn, and I watched him not quite let himself believe it. The third day, a paper came back. Lord Cassius signed papers on the king's behalf, small things, warrants and monies and appointments, the 10,000 levers of the daily house. And for 4 years the king had signed above his brother-in-law's hand without a glance, trusting him, because trust was the arrangement between them. On the third day a paper Cassius had signed came back down from the king's rooms unsigned above it, with no note, no reason, no word. Just a paper, returned. And then another. And within a week every paper that passed through Cassius's hand came back unsigned, and the whole machinery of his power, which was nothing but the king's willingness to sign where Cassius pointed, ground quietly, completely, and unanswerably to a halt. There was no order that this be done. That was the genius of it and the horror. No one could point to a command because there was no command. The king had simply stopped signing, and 100 clerks and stewards and secretaries, who lived by reading the smallest shift in the king's favor the way I read weather, saw that the king's hand no longer moved for Lord Cassius, and needing no telling, they stopped moving for him too. The chamberlain who owed his place to Cassius grew distant. The secretary Verena had recommended began, apologetically, to lose Verena's messages. The great ladies who had courted Verena's favor discovered pressing reasons to be elsewhere, not because anyone told them to, because they felt the ground tilt, and a courtier who feels the ground tilt moves downhill from the falling before he has consciously decided anything at all. And through all of it, this is the part I want you to hold. The king said nothing. He was unfailingly correct. He did not scowl at Cassius or cut Verena in public. He was simply, perfectly, terribly absent from them. His eyes passed over them as they had passed over them that first morning, forward and level, and it drove them slowly out of their minds, because there was nothing to seize on, nothing to answer, nothing to which they could say I am sorry or I can explain or what have I done. A courtier can survive the king's anger. Anger is a door, and a door can be knocked on. What no courtier can survive is the king's silence, which is a wall with no door in it anywhere, and which tells you only, over and over, that you have ceased to exist. They came to me in the end. I did not expect it, and I should have. When every other door is walled up, a drowning person will clutch at the last thing floating. And the last thing floating, though they did not know why, was the guard who stood the corridors and saw everything and belonged, they supposed, to no faction at all. Lady Verena came first. She was too clever to come clumsily. She came, as she did everything, sideways. She stopped by my post on a thin errand as she had in the days of her watching, but the woman who stopped now was not the watcher who had threatened me with a warmer station. This was a woman whose careful world had begun to come apart in her hands, and who could not, for all her cleverness, find the seam. "You see everything on these corridors, Kettle," she said. Her voice was still soft, but there was a thread pulled tight under it now. "You saw the Princess Malin taken to the country. You see the king each day." She paused, and I watched her choose her words the way a woman chooses her footing on ice. "Has the king said anything? Of my family? Of any displeasure?" And there it was. The whole of the family's ruin, folded into a single question, a frightened woman was reduced to asking a guard, "Has he said anything?" Because that was all they had left to cling to, the hope that somewhere, sometime, the king had said something, given some reason, opened some door they could find and knock on and enter and set right. They could not conceive of a punishment with no words in it. They kept looking for the sentence that had been passed on them, and there was no sentence, and the not finding of it was slowly breaking them. I answered her as a piece of furniture answers. "The king says very little these days, my lady," I said. "It is a quiet season." I watched that land. I watched her here in the flatness of it, that even the guard would give her nothing, that the silence had reached down even to the furniture. And I watched the last of her composure crack, just at the corner of her mouth, just for a moment before she gathered it back. And she went away, and she did not threaten me with a colder post, because she understood at last that she no longer had the power to move a guard from a station, that her hand had come off that lever with all the others, and that the man she had once been able to banish with a soft word now stood before her more solid and more permanent than she was. Cassius came a day later, and Cassius did not come sideways. Cassius came the way a strong man comes when his strength has stopped working and he does not yet believe it. He planted himself in front of my post and demanded, low and hard, to know what I had seen the night the princess was taken. Who had come, who had gone, who had carried her, by whose leave? He was trying, I understood, to reconstruct the thing that had been done to him, to find the mechanism, to catch hold of one solid fact he could pull on. And I gave him nothing, because I had nothing to give a man like that, and because I had stood in a dark corridor all winter learning exactly how much a silence can do to the guilty. "I am only a guard, my lord," I said. "I stand where I am posted and I see what passes. I could not say who comes and goes by the leave of the king's own sister." The king's own sister, I let those words sit. And I watched Lord Cassius understand, at last, the thing his cleverer sister had already begun to understand, that the power that had turned against them was not a faction they could outmaneuver, not a rival they could buy or frighten, but the king himself, moving through the one channel their whole design had never thought to close. His own blood, his own silence, his own crown. There was no fighting it. There was nowhere to appeal. The man they had walled in with grief and gratitude had walked out of the wall, and now the wall was closing on them, one silent day at a time, and there was not one thing in all their careful machinery that could stop it, because their machinery had only ever run on the king's willingness to let it, and that willingness was simply, wordlessly, gone. Cassius stood a long time in front of my post. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor, and I noticed that he did not walk the way he had walked all the years I had known him. The broadness had gone out of him. He walked like a man going down a stair in the dark, feeling for a step that was not there. The Queen Consort herself never came to me. She was above that to the end. Whatever else Morwenna was, she was not a woman to beg a guard. But I saw her in those days, and I will tell you what I saw, for it is the last thing I have to tell before the end, and it is the thing that has stayed with me longest. I saw her understand. She came down the east stair one morning near the end of it, as the king was crossing the hall below, and she paused on the landing where the light came through the tall windows, and she looked down at her husband, at the king who no longer spoke to her family, no longer signed for her brother, no longer received her sister, who was quietly, completely, dismantling everything she had built without ever once telling her why. And Alaric, crossing below, felt her looking, and he stopped, and he looked up at her. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across that gray light, the king and the Queen Consort, husband and wife, and neither of them said a word, and I stood my post below and watched the whole truth pass between them in that silence. She could not know what he knew. He had never told her, would never tell her, that a bottle had been read in a chapel on the last night of winter. But she was a clever woman, clever than her brother, near as clever as her sister, and she looked down into her husband's still, cold, absolutely composed face, the face that had greeted her family every morning for 4 years and now greeted no one, and she understood without a single word that he knew. Not the whole of it, perhaps, but enough. She saw in his silence that the tide had turned, and that it had turned all the way, and that whatever came next would come slowly and quietly and without appeal, and that there was nothing in all her position and her machinery and her 4 years of careful work that she could do to turn it back. Her hand tightened on the stone rail, just that. The same small tell her sister had shown, the hand closing on the nearest solid thing. And then she gathered herself, as her kind always gather themselves, and she inclined her head to her husband, a small, correct, queenly nod, and Alaric, after a pause just long enough to be its own sentence, inclined his head in return. And she went on down the stair, and he went on across the hall, and not one word had been spoken, and everything had been said. I never forgot that nod he gave her back, It was the only courtesy he showed her family in all those weeks, and it was the coldest thing I ever saw him do. It said, "I see you seeing it." It said, "Yes." It said, "And there is nothing you can do." A lesser man would have shouted. A cruder man would have charged her in open council and given her the door to fight through. Alaric gave her a nod and let her carry the whole weight of her ruin down the stair in her own 2 hands, in silence, exactly as she had carried a false draft up the back stair to his daughter, night on night, all that long winter. That, I think, is what a silence is for. But the end of it came without ceremony, as the king had meant it to. There was no trial, no proclamation, no scaffold, none of the loud machinery a lesser vengeance would have demanded. There was only, one gray morning 3 weeks after the last day of winter, a small quiet reordering of the household that a stranger would not even have noticed. Lord Cassius was released from his 3 councils. Not dismissed in disgrace. The king's letter, when it finally came, was a model of correctness, but thanked for his service and relieved of it, on the grounds that the affairs of the councils were being reorganized. Lady Verena's apartments in the palace were, with every courtesy, required for another purpose, and rooms were found for her in a house in the town. A fine house, an unimpeachable house, but a house that was not the palace, and every soul at court understood the difference. The physicians who had come by night were never seen again. I do not know what became of them, and I did not ask, for it was not a guard's business. But I know that Adela's word went quietly to certain quarters, and that men who poison a child do not practice their trade long once a princess of the blood has read their drafts. And Morwenna herself, she kept her title. That surprised many later, when the shape of it was half guessed at. But I understood it, standing where I stood. The king could not put away his Queen Consort without a public reason, and a public reason meant a public accusation, and a public accusation meant giving the family the open fight the king had refused them from the first. So Morwenna kept the name of Queen Consort, and lost everything that had ever made the name worth having. Her family was gone from the palace. Her machinery was dismantled. Her brother was a private man in the country and her sister a lodger in the town, and she herself lived on in the palace as a kind of monument to her own defeat, greeted with perfect courtesy by a husband who never again spoke to her of anything that mattered, honored in every form and trusted in nothing. She was a queen of empty rooms, and she lived so, I am told, for the rest of her days, correct, comfortable, and utterly powerless, which was, I have come to believe, a heavier sentence than any the king could have handed down in open court. He gave her exactly what she had built her whole life to seize, the outward show of a great position, and he took away, in silence, the only thing under it that she had ever truly wanted, which was the power to reach the people she loved and the child she had wronged. She had them and could not use them. She had the crown and it was empty. That was Alaric's justice, and I have never known a cleaner one. The Princess Malin Mendied. That is the thing I hold to, above all the rest of it, when I remember that winter. She mendied in her aunt's house at the edge of the town, on true food and true rest, and the true medicine the old palace physician had once given her, the sweet one, that she had begged for through her fever, and by the height of the spring she was a child again, brown and quick and loud, with a plate her aunt could keep no straighter than her nurse had. She came back to the palace in the summer, and I stood the corridor she ran down, and I will not pretend my eyes were dry. A guard is a piece of furniture. But there are mornings when even furniture is glad. She never knew what had been done to her, or what had been done to undo it. The king saw to that, and I honored him for it. A child should not carry the knowledge that her stepmother's family sickened her for a crown. Let her carry instead a memory of a hard winter's fever and a spring that came. If she ever wondered in later years why the guard who stood the sickroom corridor watched her with such particular gladness whenever she passed, she never asked, and I never told her, and that was as it should be. I was posted the following autumn to the king's own gate, a promotion, though no one called it that, arranged in the same quiet way everything of that winter had been arranged. No letter said why. but I understood it. The king, who never spoke of the thing to me again, who passed me at my new post each morning with the same level forward-looking eyes he gave to all his household, moved me to the gate nearest his person and left me there for the rest of my service. And that was his thanks, and it was enough, and it was more than a man of my trade has any right to expect. Only once did he ever come near to speaking of it. It was years on, near the end of my service, on a gray day much like the day it had all begun. The king was old by then, and I was growing old, and he stopped at my gate, which he had never once done in all those years, and he stood a moment looking out at the winter sky, and he said, not turning his head, in that same level water-still voice, "You could not reach me." I have thought of that, Kettle, all this time, that a child was harmed under my own roof, and the one honest man who saw it could not reach me, because I had let my house be built so that the truth had to pass through the hands of the people keeping it from me. He was quiet a moment. A king should be reachable by his lowest guard. I was not. That was my failing, and it near cost me my daughter, and I have never forgiven myself for it, and I never will. I did not know what a guard says to that, so I said the only true thing I had. You were reachable in the end, sire, in the 1 hour that mattered. In the 1 hour that mattered, he agreed. And he looked at me then, an old king at an old guard, and he said, "You left your post." "I did, sire." "Never do it again," he said. And the corner of his mouth moved, the nearest thing to a smile I ever saw on him, and he walked on. And that was the whole of the thanks and the whole of the reproach, and I have carried both of them proudly to this day. Let people who remember that winter tell it wrong. They tell it as a story of a wicked queen and a righteous king and a great uncovering, all thunder and revelation. It was none of those things. It was quieter than that and stranger, and I think truer to how the world actually turns. The truth of it is that the largest thing I ever saw a man do, he did by not doing. King Alaric ended the grip of his wife's family on his house and saved his youngest child, and he did it without an accusation, without a trial, without one raised voice or one drawn sword. He did it with a withheld greeting, an unsigned paper, an unreceived visitor, a level forward-looking pair of eyes that simply, day by day, stopped granting the favor that had made 3 clever people powerful. He gave them nothing to fight, and so they could not fight, and in the end the whole weight of their ruin was a thing they carried down a stair in their own hands, in silence, exactly as they had earned it. And my part in it, the part no one knows, the part I have told to no living soul until now, was only this: that I stood a cold corridor 2 nights in 7, and I saw a tray carried up a back stair by a hand that should have sent a servant, and I heard a child say no, and I did not look away. Everything else grew from that, not from a hero's charge, from a guard's refusal to unsee what he had seen. That is the trade in the end, not the standing still, though the standing still is what people watch, the seeing. A guard is a man they set at a door and teach to say nothing, and they forget, all of them, that a man set at a door for 11 years sees more of the truth of a house than anyone who lives in it. They walk past him as they walk past the furniture. And now and then, once in a long cold winter, the furniture sees a wrong being done to a helpless child, and holds the knowing quietly in its 2 hands, and finds a way to carry it to the one man who can set it right, and then steps back into the corner and lets a king's silence do the rest. King Alaric stayed silent, and by the time the Queen Consort's family understood that everything had changed, it had already entirely changed, and the only sound in the whole of it, from the first gray morning to the last, was the sound of a great house quietly closing its doors, one after another, on the people who had thought themselves too clever and too comfortable ever to be shut out. I stood every one of those doors. It was the finest duty of my life.